Hi friends, tonight we're going to do something a little reckless and a little cozy at the same time. Because while you are lying there in a warm bed with a roof that doesn't leak and walls that don't rattle in the wind, I'm going to drop you into a world where winter was not a mood or a season on a calendar, but a question that hung over every family like a whispered threat. A world where if you misjudged the firewood by a few days or left one crack too wide in the wall, the cold could quite literally kill you. So before we step into that world of mud walls, thatched roofs and crackling hearths, take a second to breathe, relax your shoulders, and if you genuinely enjoy these slow journeys into the past, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels honest and not like homework. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there? On your side of the world, is it late enough that the room around you is quiet and dim, and you can let your mind drift a little? Because if it is, this might be the perfect moment for a historical bedtime story, the kind that moves slowly and softly, like snow falling in the dark. So if you can, turn down the lights a notch, feel the weight of the blanket over you, and imagine yourself stepping out of your own century and into a different one entirely, where comfort was rare and survival was a craft. You find yourself standing at the edge of a frost-covered field, the ground beneath your boots so hard it feels like iron, every step echoing the simple truth that the season has changed, that the softness of autumn is gone, and the land has pulled tight and silent under the first skin of winter. And as you stand there, your breath slipping out in pale clouds, snowflakes begin to drift down, light and lazy, a gentle curtain that hides the fact that somewhere above this village, the real winter is gathering its strength, turning winds into blades and storms into walls. Ahead of you lies a small medieval village, nothing romantic or picturesque about it, just low cottages crouched against the cold, roofs like hunched shoulders, smoke drifting thinly from holes in thatch. And as you walk closer, you can feel that this place lives according to a rule you are no longer used to. Winter is not an inconvenience to complain about. It is a test that you either pass or fail, and failing means not making it through to spring. The peasants around you move with a kind of quiet urgency that has nothing theatrical about it. They are gathering armfuls of firewood, carrying bundles of straw on their backs, checking the roofs, repairing fences, stuffing moss into gaps in the walls, their hands and faces red from the cold, their movements practiced and precise, the result of generations who learned the hard way that you do not wait for the first heavy snow to start worrying about warmth. You prepare long before the first flake touches the ground. You might feel an instinctive desire to pull away from this scene and step back into your heated room. But for a while tonight you stay, standing on that frozen track that leads into the village, listening to the muffled thud of axes in the forest and the rhythm of wood being stacked. And you begin to understand that for these people, the house itself is not just where they live, it is the line that separates life from death, a fragile fortress made of whatever the land is willing to offer them. As you follow a narrow path between cottages, you notice how simple they look at first glance. Huts of wood and earth and straw, leaning a little, stained by smoke and rain, but beneath that rough surface there is a kind of quiet intelligence, because these homes were not designed to be pretty. They were designed to trap heat and hold it the way your duvet holds your warmth. Now, every beam and handful of mud placed with winter in mind, the first thing that strikes you is the wood. Because in this world, the forest is both enemy and ally, dark and dangerous, but full of the only material that can become walls, beams, and firewood. And the peasants know it intimately. They can tell at a glance which tree will give straight, strong timbers, and which can be spared without ruining the grove. So they move among the trunks with care, felling smaller or weakened trees, cutting them into lengths, dragging them home in creaking sledges or on stooped shoulders, always thinking not just of this winter but of the next. Back in the village, those logs are laid horizontally, not thrown together at random but stacked, so that each one supports the next, the gaps between them carefully filled with mud, clay, moss, and straw, sometimes with chopped plant fibers or even animal dung mixed in, a crude mixture at first sight, but in truth a kind of primitive insulation, because the earth holds heat, and once it dries it hardens into a thick skin that slows the wind and keeps the warmth from escaping too quickly into the night. If you look closely at a wall, while the light is still good, you can see the pattern of this work, the way straw threads through the mud like veins, giving it a little flexibility so that it doesn't crack apart during the endless cycle of freezing and thawing. And though modern historians still like to argue about which regions used more clay, which relied on more straw, and how exactly the recipes varied from valley to valley, the peasants themselves are not interested in theories. They are interested in what keeps the cold out, and they have learned this not from books but from the memory of winters that hurt. The roof above your head when you step inside one of these houses in your imagination is even more important than the walls, because snow is heavy and patient. It collects quietly, hour after hour, until a careless roof can simply fold under its weight, so the peasants build them steep, giving the snow slide and angle, covering a wooden frame with thick layers of thatch made from straw, reeds, rushes, or heather, each bundle laid carefully over the next, so the rain and snow flow down like water off a bird's feathers, rather than seeping through. Over time that thatch compacts under its own weight, the stray stalks pressed tighter and tighter together by rain and wind, until it becomes not just a roof but a sort of breathing blanket over the house, trapping air inside its layers. And in some regions people even smear animal fat or other greasy substances over the upper surface of the thatch to make it more water resistant, a detail that might sound strange when you first hear it, but makes perfect sense when you imagine months of melting and refreezing snow trying to work its way in. Even the placement of the cottage is a kind of quiet calculation, because a house is not dropped just anywhere. It is turned toward what little winter sun there is, so that any weak light that creeps across the sky can touch its walls and door, giving a few extra degrees of warmth to the interior and a slightly drier threshold underfoot. And wherever possible the cottage sits on a patch of slightly raised ground, safe from meltwater and dampness that would creep up through the floor like a slow, invisible frost. When you step inside, the change is immediate and almost shocking, not because it's hot the way your room can be, but because there is a difference, a boundary. Outside the air is a biting thing that stings your lungs. Inside it is softer, scented not with artificial perfume but with earth, smoke, wool, and wood, and at the very centre of that difference lies the hearth. The hearth is not a neat fireplace with a polished mantle. It is often little more than an open fire on a slightly raised patch of hardened earth or stone, sometimes with a simple hood or vent, but often with no chimney in the way you would expect, just a hole where smoke can eventually find its way out. And yet this smoking, crackling circle of flame is the true heart of the house. Everything else is arranged around it like planets around a small, stubborn sun. The fire gives light, a flickering, uneven kind that throws shadows up along the mud walls and across the beams. It warms the air nearest to it and, just as importantly, warms the walls and floor themselves, slowly saturating them with stored heat, so that when the flames sink lower, the house does not instantly become as cold as the night outside. And although some scholars see only the smoke and soot and imagine endless coughing and aching lungs, others point out that in a world of damp, chill air, the drying effect of constant low heat might have saved as many lives as it shortened. For the people living here, the question is simpler and more immediate than any academic debate. If the fire burns, there is warmth, there is cooked food, there is a place where fingers can thaw and clothes can dry, and if the fire dies, the cold will slide in and claim the room by morning. So the fire is tended with an attention you normally reserve for alarms and phone batteries. Someone always listening for the shift in its crackle, always ready to stir the embers, add another piece of wood, coax another hour of heat from the coals. That wood itself is a whole story of survival, because firewood is not limitless, and it cannot simply be grabbed at random. Wet wood smokes and hisses and stubbornly refuses to catch. So all through autumn and well into the first weeks of winter, peasants are cutting, splitting, stacking, always measuring in their heads how much they might need, how many nights remain before the first thaw, and how many trips into the forest their bodies can still manage when the snow comes up to their knees and the wind lashes their faces raw. In some places, villagers share this burden, taking turns gathering wood from common land, piling it in shared spaces, or helping older and weaker neighbours fill their stores. And though historians like to argue about how formally this sharing was organised, whether wood was considered a common right or strictly a household responsibility, you can see with your own inner eyes something simpler. In a winter that knows no mercy, it is very difficult to watch a neighbour's fire go out and pretend it has nothing to do with you. The floor beneath you, as you shift closer to the imaginary fire, is not insulated with modern foam or softened with thick carpets. It is usually packed earth or clay, sometimes covered in flat stones, and over that a spread of rushes, straw, or old reeds that catch dust and dropped crumbs and provide a little bit of extra softness and insulation. And in particularly harsh regions you might even find animal skins laid down, their fur providing a barrier between the freezing ground and human feet. Scholars still discuss how different the floors would have looked from one end of Europe to the other, whether northern peasants relied more on heavy straw and hides while milder regions managed with simple earth and rushes. But again, those are the questions that come long after the fact, when the winter you are imagining now was already long survived or lost. And for the people who lived it, the question was far more direct. Is the ground dry enough that the cold doesn't climb straight into our bones? Can we lie down without our blankets soaking up the damp? As you sit there, almost feeling the prickly texture of the straw under your palms, the fire popping gently in front of you, you start to notice the smells, the earthy scent of dried mud warming on the walls, the smoky thickness of the air, the lanolin tang of wool, the faint, sharp note of animals, and people living in very close quarters. And although to a modern nose it might seem heavy and strange, for the people here it is the smell of safety. Smoke in the rafters means the fire is alive. Damp wool, drying at the edge of the hearth, means clothes will be warm when someone has to step out into the snow again. The house itself continues upward into that smoky darkness, and in many regions just beyond the thin wall, or at the far end of the same room, you find the animals, not the entire herd or flock, but the ones that matter most through the winter. A cow, a few pigs, some sheep or goats, chickens huddled on a rough perch, and their presence is not just practical in terms of milk and meat. They are also living heaters, warm bodies that share their heat through the walls and the air, helping to raise the temperature inside by a few precious degrees. Even their dung, unpleasant as it might sound when you are lying in a clean bed 1,000 years later, is pressed into service, mixed with straw and mud, packed into gaps between logs to form a surprisingly effective insulating material that hardens and seals out the cold. Another reminder that in a world like this, almost nothing is truly waste. Everything is weighed against the single question of whether it might help someone stay alive a little longer. Outside, the winter deepens, the light shrinks to a brief pale arc each day, and life within the house settles into a rhythm that feels slow and monotonous to you at first, but reveals its own quiet structure if you let your mind drift with it. Wake in the dim light, coax the fire, break the ice on the water bucket, tend the animals, sweep and tidy, prepare food, repair tools, spin and weave, mend clothes, share stories, sleep, and repeat, each task small in itself, but together forming a net that catches the days and keeps them from unraveling into chaos. Food becomes another layer of the architecture of survival, as important as any wall or roof beam, and in your mind's eye you see the root cellar dug down into the earth, cool even in summer, now functioning as a vault of sorts, shelves and pits holding turnips, cabbages, onions, carrots, dried beans, sacks of grain, smoked meat hanging from beams, salted fish in barrels, jars of preserved fruit, if the year was generous, Every item carefully counted and rationed, so that there is enough to cross the barren months when nothing grows. The meals cooked in the hearth's glow are simple and repetitive, thick stews of grain and vegetables, sometimes enriched with a small piece of meat or a bone to lend its flavour, coarse bread baked when the stores allow it, perhaps a rare sweet or treat at midwinter, if someone saved honey or dried fruit. And though your modern taste might call this plain, the warmth of the bowl between chilled fingers, the steam softening the air, and the shared silence as the family eats together make these moments feel like small celebrations of survival. Nothing is wasted, not a crust of bread or a shard of bone. Leftovers become tomorrow's soup. Bones are boiled until they give up every bit of flavour and nutrition. Fat is carefully saved to be used in cooking, in waterproofing, even in little lamps that flicker beside the hearth. And this relentless frugality, far from being joyless, is a kind of discipline that keeps fear at bay, because as long as there is one more way to stretch a resource, there is one more day between the family and hunger. Clothing, too, is part of this slow architecture of warmth. Layers of wool woven from the fleeces of the village's sheep, tunics and dresses and cloaks thick and scratchy and heavy, stitched and restitched until the fabric almost remembers the shape of the body beneath it, stockings and hoods and mittens spun and knitted by hands that move almost automatically during the long dark evenings, and over all of it simple leather shoes or boots, sometimes lined with wool or fur, sometimes stuffed with straw for extra insulation. When someone steps outside, you can almost hear the soft squeak of packed snow under those boots, the distant dull thud of an axe biting into wood, the small clatter of a bucket being carried to the well, and then the door opens and the cold sweeps in, a sharp, immediate presence, and for a few seconds the room seems to inhale firelight flickering, blankets pulled closer, until the door closes again, the latch falls, and the fragile little world of the house seals itself off once more from the white silence. The longer the winter lasts, the more this little world depends on the invisible ties between houses, and if you drift in your mind from one hearth to another, you can sense the web of shared effort. A neighbour bringing a bundle of wood to an older widow whose sons are far away, another family sharing a pot of stew, when a cow has slipped on the ice and been lost, people trading cloth for grain, tools for meat, stories for comfort, and in this constant exchange the village becomes a single organism, holding itself together against the cold. Historians often debate exactly how communal medieval village life really was, whether families were fiercely independent or deeply intertwined, but on nights like this, with the wind screaming past the low walls and snow piling up against doors, it's hard to imagine survival without some degree of sharing, because the cold does not care about property lines. It tests every roof and every fire equally, and the warmth that leaks out of one house softens the edges of its neighbours as well. Around the hearth, when the work of the day is done, the mood shifts almost imperceptibly from survival to endurance. Stories are told, not loudly or theatrically, but in a gentle, flowing way, tales of past winters, of foolish mistakes and narrow escapes, of wolves in the forest, of early springs and late ones, of saints and spirits, of loved ones gone, and as the words ripple through the smoky air, the fear and loneliness that winter carries in its shadow seem to shrink a little, contained by shared memory. Some modern scholars like to speak of this as a kind of early psychology, a way of processing anxiety, and they may be right, but for the peasants themselves, it is simply what you do when the night is long and the tasks are few. You keep the fire alive, you keep the food stretching, and you keep each other company, and in that steady routine, the cold becomes something you live with, rather than something that swallows you. There are days, of course, when even the best preparations feel thin, when a storm howls for hours, wrapping itself around the house like an angry animal, when snow piles so high that doors must be dug open, when a trip to fetch water or wood means fighting wind that burns the skin and steals the breath. And on such days you might see peasants improvising small shelters out in the fields or woods, little lean toes of branches half buried in snow, where a person can crouch for a while, shielded just enough to catch their breath before pushing on. This is not the tidy, romantic version of medieval life you sometimes see in paintings. It is messy and exhausting and often frightening. And yet, as you watch this winter from your safe distance, something else begins to glow beneath the smoke and the hardship. A kind of quiet admiration for the way these people have learned to work with their world, to read the land and the sky, to turn mud, straw, dung, wood and stone into a system that, while always precarious, is just strong enough to carry them from one spring to the next. As the weeks crawl by, a subtle change creeps into the light outside the small window. The sun lingers a little longer at the rim of the sky. The shadows shift, and somewhere deep in the soil, seeds and roots wait in a tension that is almost like breath held. And inside the house, though the routine remains the same, there is a tiny easing of shoulders, a sense that the worst may be passing, however slowly. The fire still burns, but now it feels slightly less like the only line between life and death, and slightly more like an old friend whose company you've grown used to. The pile of wood is lower than anyone would like, but still not gone. The food stores are thinned, jars and sacks and hooks more bare than in early winter, yet there is just enough, and the peasants begin to talk in low, practical tones about mending ploughs, checking seeds, turning the soil when it finally yields. On one of these late winter days, you step outside in your imagination and feel something that is not quite warmth but not entirely cold either. A softness in the air, the snow no longer crunching glass hard underfoot, but giving slightly the faint sound of dripping from a roof where icicles begin to loosen their grip. And that tiny change ripples through the village like news, not shouted, not celebrated with fanfare, but acknowledged in small, relieved glances and slightly longer steps. The houses themselves bear the marks of the season. Thatch flattened and darkened, mud walls cracked here and there where the freeze and thaw have tugged at them. And so, as soon as the weather allows, repairs begin. Fresh mud pressed into gaps, new straw laid on the roof, beams checked, floors re-leveled, and in this careful attention you can see that the peasants understand something we easily forget. A house that saves you one winter will not automatically save you the next, unless you keep making it new. Inside, the hearth is still the center of the room, still glowing with coals, but in the afternoons the door may stand open for a while, letting in fresher air, lighter air, the smoke clearing a little faster, the children daring to step outside and feel sun on their faces without immediately being chased back in. And you realize that the house is breathing too, tightening in winter, loosening in spring, shrinking and expanding with the seasons just as the people do. Food shifts as well, the last of the preserved stores being used with a mix of caution and gratitude, while early greens and herbs, once they appear in the hedges and fields, are gathered with a sort of quiet joy, not because they are luxurious but because they taste of something alive, something that has grown under a sky that is no longer entirely hostile. And the first fresh bite after months of salted and dried food is as much a signal of survival as any date on a calendar. The animals, which have spent the winter in close, cramped quarters, begin to stir with more energy, noses turned toward the door, hooves scraping lightly. And as they too begin to go out more often, the smell inside the house changes, the air feels less heavy, and life starts slowly to move outward again. First a step beyond the threshold, then a few hours in the fields, then full days of work under a sun that feels timid but determined. You watch all of this unfold as though in slow motion, and somewhere deep in the background of your mind where your own worries and schedules live, something softens a little, because the pattern you've just drifted through is both utterly alien and strangely familiar. Preparation, hardship, endurance, repair, renewal, a cycle that these peasants lived with every year, a cycle that shaped their houses, their bodies, their stories, and their sense of each other. When you turn your attention back to the interior of the cottage one last time, the fire is still there, though smaller now, more companion than guardian. Its light washing over the same walls of mud and straw, The same beams that have held snow and wind at bay, and you begin to see the house less as a static object, and more as a kind of woven thing, made from earth and wood and smoke, and human effort, constantly maintained, constantly adjusted, a shelter that exists as much in shared labour and shared memory as in any single piece of timber. And as you lie there in your own warm room, listening to whatever quiet sounds your night is made of, you may find that the medieval village has not quite let you go, that somewhere just behind your closed eyes there is still a hearth glowing in the dark, a roof holding back the snow, people huddled together under rough woolen blankets, trusting not just in their walls but in each other, waiting patiently for the light of another spring to arrive. If your eyes feel heavier now and your breathing has settled into a slow, steady rhythm, you can let this village fade gently into the distance, knowing that their winter has been endured once again. And if you'd like, we can return another night to walk those same frozen paths and look more closely at how they slept, how they dreamed, and how they carried their lives through seasons that never promised them anything. But for tonight, it's enough just to feel the warmth of your own bed, and to know that somewhere in the long story of human winters, you have just shared a little time by someone else's fire. Night in a medieval village does not simply fall the way it does for us. It settles slowly, heavily, like a thick woolen cloak laid across the land, muffling sound, dimming sight, and reminding everyone that the warmth of the day is gone, and that the true battle of winter begins only when the last traces of light disappear. And if you let your imagination drift for a moment, you can almost feel the air tightening, the wood creaking softly in the walls, and the wind slipping its thin fingers through every gap it can find, preparing you to understand what it meant for a medieval family to do something as seemingly simple as going to bed. Sleep was not a luxury or a gentle escape, but a nightly act of survival, because in these low, smoky homes warmed by a single struggling hearth, the darkness brought with it a cold so deep and persistent that rest became secondary to the much more urgent need to preserve heat, and families lay down not just to rest their bodies, but to defend them against the long hours when the world outside tried its hardest to steal that heat away. The first thing you notice inside the home is the bed, though calling it a bed might conjure an image far softer than what a medieval family actually had, because in most peasant homes the bed was a beautifully simple creation of necessity and resourcefulness, a wooden frame if the family was lucky, lifted slightly from the floor to keep away moisture, or just a low platform built from rough planks covered with a thick layer of straw or hay, and then draped with whatever they had, wool blankets, if fortune smiled, coarse linens if it didn't, and in many cases animal skins, their fur still intact, offering a warmth that wool alone could never match. When you sit on such a bed, even only in your mind, you can feel the unevenness beneath the blankets, the faint rustle of straw shifting under your weight, and yet, despite its roughness, it was a cherished place, because it meant warmth. It meant a barrier, however thin, between your body and the frozen ground that waited just inches below. Medieval people slept in layers the way we might dress in layers for a long journey through snow. Long woolen tunics, shirts, hose, thick socks, sometimes hats pulled low over their ears, because removing clothing to sleep was a luxury reserved for warmer seasons and warmer houses, and even then only by those who could afford to ignore the cold's persistent reach. Children were bundled most carefully of all, wrapped tightly in blankets or skins, placed closest to the adults so that their small bodies could borrow heat from older ones. In many families, the youngest slept literally pressed between their parents or older siblings, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity, because a child's body loses warmth quickly, and no one, not even the hardest peasant, could bear the thought of waking to find a little one stiff with cold, and so sleeping became a communal act, a shared warmth, a shared breath, a cluster of bodies arranged to survive the night together. For in a world without central heating or thick insulation, human heat became the most reliable source of warmth, and families learned to make the most of it by piling close, pulling blankets high, and letting the rhythm of each other's breathing fill the room with a soft, constant reassurance. The hearth, even in the deepest night, was never allowed to die completely. Someone always tended it before lying down, banking the fire beneath a blanket of ash to keep embers alive until morning, because if the fire went out entirely, the cold would claim the room within hours, creeping floorward first, numbing toes and fingers, then settling deeper into bones in a way that could become dangerous before anyone realized it was happening. You can picture it now, a faint red glow beneath ash, the last whisper of warmth flickering in the darkness while the rest of the room sinks into shadow, and above it all the slow settling of breath, the quiet shuffling of blankets, the sighs of people surrendering to sleep, while still half alert to the cold pressing against the walls. In many regions, winter nights were so brutal that families brought their smallest animals indoors, not the whole flock or herd, but a few chickens, a weak lamb, or even a young calf, whose warm bodies added precious degrees of heat to the room. And though the modern mind might wrinkle at the idea, medieval peasants saw only practicality, life protecting life, warmth given and returned, a tiny living heater curled in straw at the edge of the bed or near the hearth. Even the arrangement of the room was chosen with cold in mind. Beds were pushed against inner walls rather than outer ones to escape drafts, and windows, if the house had any, were shuttered tightly with wooden boards, leaving the room almost completely dark, which suited the peasants just fine, because darkness kept heat close like a second blanket. By midnight, the world outside had faded into absolute stillness, snow thickening on the roofs, wind pausing between long sighs, and inside the house the air grew heavy with the scents of wool, smoke, straw, and breath, a mixture that might seem harsh to us but carried a strange comfort for them, because it meant safety. It meant that everyone inside was alive and warm enough to sleep. And in that darkness, in that shared bed, medieval families found a fragile peace, not luxurious, not gentle, but steady and determined, a peace built not on comfort but on resilience, the kind that grows when people endure together what would be unbearable alone. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the quiet shifting of bodies, the rustle of blankets, the soft exhale of someone turning over in their sleep, the tiny crackle of the embers in the hearth, and the snow hushing the world outside until morning. As the night deepens, something almost imperceptible begins to happen inside the medieval home, a slow settling of warmth that gathers around the bodies pressed together under coarse blankets, because unlike the world you know, where heaters hum softly and thermostats hold the line against winter, the warmth in this room is a living thing, fragile, flickering, dependent entirely on the quiet determination of those who sleep and those embers glowing faintly beneath the ash in the hearth. The oldest members of the family usually sleep closest to the wall, their bodies curved inward like shields protecting the younger ones, who lie sandwiched between parents, siblings, and blankets that smell faintly of sheep's lanolin and smoke. This closeness is not optional. It is the difference between waking in the morning and not waking at all, because the cold slips in wherever there is space, flowing like water between bodies, finding every tiny gap in the covers, and the only true barrier against it is human warmth layered upon human warmth. If you shift your attention to the children, you'll notice how carefully they are bundled, layers of wool tightly wrapped, little heads covered with knitted caps or strips of cloth tied under the chin, hands tucked deep into sleeves, feet wrapped in scrap fabric or stuffed into pouches of fur, because medieval parents understood instinctively what modern medicine now confirms: children lose heat faster than adults. And in a winter like this, losing heat even briefly could be dangerous. So every night they prepare the little ones as though sending them into battle against the cold itself. And yet, even with all these precautions, medieval families did not sleep deeply, not the way we imagine sleep to be, because their rest was constantly punctuated by small awakenings, half-conscious moments when someone lifted a corner of a blanket to adjust it, when the father reached out automatically to check if a child's feet were still warm, when a mother listened for the breathing of her baby and pressed closer, if she felt the air growing colder. Sleep was a fragile arrangement, light, easily disturbed, always shared. Outside, the night is utterly still, snow muting every sound. The village wrapped in a silence so complete it becomes almost musical. And you might think that nothing moves out there, but the peasants know better. They know the forest doesn't sleep entirely, that wolves sometimes pass along the tree line, silent shadows pacing just beyond the edge of the fields, their paws sinking softly into the snow, their breath rising in pale moonlit clouds. And though the wolves rarely approach the houses themselves, their presence hums at the edges of the villagers' minds, a quiet tension that lingers even in dreams. Inside, however, the danger is more subtle, smoke gathering in the rafters, drafts creeping through cracks, frost forming on the inside of the walls, the fire threatening at times to fade too low. And in those moments, one person, usually the lightest sleeper in the family, stirs, rises carefully so as not to disturb the others, and crosses the room with a practiced quiet, lifting the ash with a small wooden stick to reveal the glowing heart beneath, adding a piece of wood just big enough to feed the fire without waking everyone else. The warmth expands almost immediately, a soft ripple of heat moving outward like a sigh, brushing across faces and hands, slipping under blankets, comforting the sleeping family the way a parent might adjust a blanket over a child's shoulders. And with that warmth the caretaker lies back down, pulling the covers over themselves, letting the hearth resume its steady pulse. It is in these hours, deep winter hours when time feels suspended, that the medieval night becomes something different from the day, not simply darker but more intimate, more revealing, because here in the dark you sense every small sound with amplified meaning, the slow crackle of drying wood, the faint breathing of animals in the next space, the shifting of straw under the bed, the whisper of wind testing the thatched roof, the almost musical ping of frost tightening its grip on the wooden beams. Even dreams in this world feel different, shaped not by glowing screams or distant thoughts, but by the simple elements of survival: fire, cold, hunger, hope, the memory of summer sun, the anticipation of spring, the fear of storms, the quiet comfort of family huddled close. And though medieval people didn't speak of REM sleep or cycles of rest, their dreams carried the same mixture of longing and meaning that ours do, filtered through the rawness of a life lived directly in the grip of nature. Hours pass like this, slow, heavy, layered, until the darkness begins to thin, not immediately but gradually, a gentle softening of shadow that seeps into the room. And even before the first true light touches the horizon, the peasants begin to stir. They always wake before sunrise in winter, partly out of habit, partly out of necessity, because the chores that ensure survival cannot wait for daylight, and the fire must be coaxed into full flame long before the coldest hour of morning arrives. Blankets shift, shoulders stretch beneath layers of wool, children burrow deeper for a final moment of warmth, and adults rise with quiet resignation, feet finding the cold earth or the straw-covered floor, faces tightening when the night's chill grips their skin. But despite this discomfort, there is something almost sacred in the act of rising from a shared bed in a medieval winter, because it means one simple thing: they made it through another night. And in a world like theirs, that was never guaranteed. Morning in a medieval winter does not announce itself with warmth or gentle light, but with a kind of pale, uncertain glow that creeps slowly into the edges of the room like a timid visitor, a faint silver pressed against the cracks of the wooden shutters. And if you lie still for a moment inside this cottage, you can feel the temperature drop even further, because dawn is often the coldest moment of the entire day, the hour when the night takes its final breath and leaves behind a world that has been stripped of every ounce of warmth. The fire did not fiercely protect. The peasants do not wake with the indulgence of stretching under blankets or waiting for comfort to arrive. They wake because they must, and the first to rise is almost always the person who slept closest to the fire. their body already half prepared for the transition from blanket warmth to the biting cold of the air. And when their feet touch the floor, there is a small shock, a sharp inhale as the cold bites up through the soles, reminding them instantly that the day's work begins not with movement, but with endurance. Their first task, without speaking, without hesitation, is always the fire, because if the fire dies, the house becomes unlivable within hours, and so they crouch beside the hearth, brushing aside the ash with practiced hands, revealing the faint shimmer of last night's coals, tiny red stars buried in grey dust, and with a few careful breaths, a bit of dry kindling, and the tender patience of someone who has performed this ritual since childhood, the flames return, small at first, uncertain, then growing, stretching upward as if remembering their purpose, sending thin ribbons of warmth back into the room where the rest of the family still lies curled beneath blankets. Only when the fire is alive again do the others begin to stir, their breaths visible in the cold air, their limbs stiff from sleeping in the same position for so many hours, and as they sit up you can see how the first light touches their faces with a muted silver, making the room look almost like an image preserved in frost, every detail softened and slowed. Children wake reluctantly, burrowing into blankets for a final moment before being coaxed out into the morning chill, their wool caps askew, their small hands held tightly near their chests, to keep the warmth from escaping, while adults begin the long ritual of layering clothes. Tunics pulled over shirts, shawls wrapped around shoulders, belts tightened, boots slipped on with murmured complaints as the leather meets cold skin. Once everyone is awake, the morning splits into a dozen quiet tasks. Someone must fetch water from the well, breaking the thin sheet of ice that has formed overnight. Someone must check the animals, thaw their water, brush snow off the thatched lean-tos where they sheltered. Someone must prepare a simple breakfast, often little more than yesterday's stew reheated over the fire, or coarse bread sliced and placed near the flames to soften. And someone must step outside to inspect the sky, the wind, the path through the snow, because winter dictates not just how you work but whether you can work at all. Stepping outside is its own small trial, because the cold hits like a wall, a sudden tightening around the lungs, a sting across the face, and the snow underfoot crunches with a crystalline sharpness that echoes across the still morning fields, and the world for a moment feels impossibly wide and impossibly silent, as though the village is the last pocket of life left on earth. The animals sense the cold too, their breaths rising in thick clouds, their movements slow and stiff, and tending to them is not optional. Because animals are wealth, animals are food, animals are survival, and so the peasants brush frost off their backs, break ice from their troughs, feed them hay that smells like the memory of summer, all the while blowing warm air into their hands and rubbing them together to keep the sting of the cold from numbing their fingers. Back inside, breakfast is eaten quickly, not leisurely, not ceremonially, but with the efficiency of people who cannot afford to linger. Because every moment spent near the fire is a moment stolen from the outside tasks that stand between them and hunger, between them and freezing, between them and the long, unyielding months ahead. The stew is warm, thick, comforting in its simplicity, steam rising into the cold air of the room, and as each person holds their bowl, the heat from the clay warms their fingers, sending little shivers of relief up their arms. Children eat with half-lidded eyes, still waking, still adjusting to the day, while the adults' faces already carry the concentration of work that must be done, plans forming silently as they chew. Once food is finished, the blankets and furs are shaken out, the bed is quickly straightened, the embers are fed again, and tools are gathered, axes for splitting firewood, baskets for carrying snow or water, crude brooms made from bundled twigs for clearing paths, heavy cloaks for the wind that will rise later. What might feel like the start of the day to us is, for them, the continuation of the fight that began the night before, the need to gather more wood so the fire lasts another night, the need to tend the animals so their warmth and food remain secure, the need to find or prepare enough food to keep the family strong enough for the next round of cold. And yet, despite the hardship, there is a kind of quiet dignity to these morning routines, a rhythm that has been repeated across centuries, a choreography of survival shaped by the land, the season, and the memory of those who came before. Even the children sense this, their small bodies mimicking the gestures of adults, learning without being taught that winter allows no laziness, no hesitation, no forgetfulness. Outside, the sun finally rises fully, though in winter it rises pale, thin, almost shy, casting a weak gold over the snow-covered fields, and for a brief moment the world sparkles as though made of crushed glass, the edges of rooftops glowing, the frozen earth shining in a cold, distant beauty that medieval peasants rarely pause to admire, but would have felt nonetheless in some quiet corner of their hearts. And all the while, through chores and breath and frost, one truth sits gently at the centre of their mourning: they survived another night, and that alone is enough to move forward into whatever the frozen day may bring. Once the pale sunlight has settled over the fields, thin, almost hesitant, as though unsure whether it belongs in such a frozen world, the villagers step into the day with a kind of steady determination that comes not from optimism, but from the understanding that winter cares very little for their fatigue, their hunger, or their grief, and that every hour of daylight must be used wisely, because daylight in winter is not a gift but a ration, measured out like food, always running low. The snow lies thick across the paths, and walking through it is an exhausting task in itself, every step sinking, every movement slowed, and even the simplest jobs, fetching water, cutting branches, checking the traps, become heavy, deliberate acts that sap the strength from legs and lungs far faster than on warmer days. Yet the villagers push forward, because winter demands work at the precise moment when the body least wants to give it. Firewood is always the first concern, because the hearth consumes it without mercy, and no matter how much was gathered in autumn, it is never enough. So the men and older boys walk to the edge of the forest, axes slung over their shoulders, their breath stretching out in long white ribbons, the quiet of the trees pressing around them like a cathedral made of frost. And when they strike the first blow into the trunk of a half-frozen tree, the sound echoes through the forest in a way that makes the world feel enormous, cold, and listening. Each chopped log is precious, each bundle of sticks a small victory, and the snow makes the work heavier. The cold makes fingers clumsy. The daylight slips away quietly behind them as they labor, reminding them that night will come again whether they are ready or not. So they gather as much as they can carry, sometimes too much, staggering back toward the village with arms burning and shoulders shaking, but relieved to know that a few more nights of fire are secured. Back in the cottages, the women keep the interior world alive, stirring stews, mending clothing, tending infants, grinding grain with slow circular motions, scraping frost from the inside of windows, checking the root cellar to ensure that nothing is spoiled, and always keeping the fire breathing, coaxing it when it sobs into smoke, feeding it small pieces of wood when it threatens to fade, because if the fire dims too far, the entire house suffers. And so throughout the day, someone is always watching the flames from the corner of an eye. Food becomes a relentless concern as winter drags on, because with each passing week the cellars grow lighter, the jars fewer, the barrels less full, and even though rationing is done with meticulous care, the peasants know that a single illness, a spoiled batch, a harsh storm can push a family dangerously close to hunger. And hunger in winter is not a momentary discomfort, but a creeping shadow that follows them everywhere, whispering quietly that spring is still far away. Illness, too, stalks the winter months, because the cold weakens bodies, smoke irritates lungs, close quarters spread infection, and without modern medicine even a simple fever can turn frightening. So when someone begins to cough or to burn with heat under layers of blankets, the entire household holds its breath, praying silently that the fireproof calm of winter will not crack open into tragedy. Superstitions emerge most clearly in winter, because winter is a fertile ground for fear, and medieval villagers, practical as they were, lived in a world filled with beliefs about spirits in the forest, omens in the wind, curses in the cold, and signs in the behavior of animals. A sudden howl at night might be taken as a warning, a strange dream as a message, a crow circling the field as an ill omen, and though these beliefs vary from place to place, the feeling beneath them is the same. Winter is a force that cannot be controlled, only respected. Isolation becomes another quiet burden, because travel is dangerous. Roads disappear beneath the snow, and entire villages may go weeks without seeing anyone from beyond their small circle, leaving people with nothing but the voices inside their homes and the sounds of the wind outside. And though families are close, sleeping together, eating together, working together, the lack of outside contact begins to settle into the mind like a slow-moving fog. The days themselves do not feel like separate days, but like repetitions of the same cold ritual. Wake before sunrise, tend the fire, eat sparingly, work, gather, mend, endure, return home, close the shutters against the night, brace for the dark, sleep lightly, and begin again. And though medieval peasants rarely spoke of depression or fatigue in the way we do today, they undoubtedly felt the emotional weight of winter pressing against their spirits. Yet even inside this harshness, there are small, delicate moments of warmth. Not just physical warmth, but emotional warmth. That flicker quietly like sparks inside a darkened room. A child laughing at the shape of their breath in the cold air. A family gathering around a pot of stew that smells of garlic, onions, and hope. A neighbour knocking softly on a door to bring a share of wood. A mother humming softly while mending a torn sleeve. The sudden joy of finding eggs in the henhouse on an unexpectedly warm morning. And perhaps the most touching of all is the way the community watches over each other. Because winter is not survived alone, and the peasants know this deeply. If one family loses their firewood, another will share a bundle. If someone falls sick, another will tend their animals. If a roof collapses under snow, the whole village will gather, tired, cold, hungry, to raise it again. Because the cold is a common enemy, a quiet tyrant that bows to no one, and only unity holds it back. By the time the sun begins to sink, the villagers feel the day slipping toward night again, a familiar pattern, and they hurry to finish whatever tasks daylight still permits, returning one by one to their cottages with cheeks reddened by wind, hands stiff from cold, breath rising in little clouds that look like pieces of their souls drifting upward. And once inside, after the door closes behind them, they release a slow, silent sigh, the sound of bodies grateful for even a moment's shelter. The fire is stirred again. Children are gathered close, blankets arranged, shoes set near the hearth to dry, tools placed in corners where frost cannot reach them, and the house begins to glow with the same low, ember-coloured warmth you left earlier. The air rich with smoke and stew and wool, the scent of another winter day survived. Outside, the sky darkens, the world turns still, and the cold resumes its vigil, waiting for the slightest mistake, the smallest gap, the quietest moment of weakness. But inside the house, the family folds back into itself, drawing warmth from fire and closeness, preparing once more for the long night ahead, trusting in each other, in the roof overhead, and in the simple, enduring strength that has carried them through every winter before this one. And as sleep slowly drapes itself over the household, you can almost feel the weight of their exhaustion blending with the faint, determined hope that tomorrow, cold, hard, and unforgiving as it may be, will find them still here, still together, still fighting gently against the winter that surrounds them. As the winter deepens and the days shrink into thin slices of pale light, a quiet tension grows beneath the routines of the medieval household, a tension the villagers rarely speak aloud but which lives in every gesture, every glance at the food store, every sigh when a pot feels lighter than it did the week before, because hunger is not a sudden event in winter. It is a slow-moving shadow creeping closer as the season progresses, whispering reminders that the earth is sleeping, and nothing new can be grown until spring returns. In the evenings, when the family gathers around the hearth and the stew simmers in its familiar pot, There is always a moment when someone lifts the lid and peers inside with a careful eye, assessing how much is left, how much must be saved, how far the food can stretch without risking tomorrow. And in that moment you can sense the weight of generations who learn to survive, not by abundance but by restraint, by a careful balance between hope and fear. Even the children feel this shadow in subtle ways, noticing how their parents' voices soften when discussing the cellar, how portions become a little smaller as the weeks go by, how treats that once appeared occasionally have now disappeared entirely, and though their young minds do not understand famine, they do understand the seriousness that fills the air like a quiet mist. To protect themselves against hunger, and perhaps to reassure their hearts as much as their stomachs, the peasants turn to faith, a constant companion of medieval life, for the church does not sleep in winter, and even when roads are buried and winds howl like unseen spirits, the villagers gather whenever they can to light candles, murmur prayers, and ask for protection from cold, illness, wolves, and the invisible hand of scarcity. The priest, wrapped in thick woolen robes that speak more of practicality than grandeur, becomes a figure of immense comfort during this season, not because he can change the weather or fill the cellars, but because his presence reminds the people that suffering is shared, that winter is a test endured not only by hands and bodies but by souls, and he speaks of perseverance, of endurance, of God's watchful eye over the fields that now lie hard and silent beneath the snow. At home, families have their own rituals, mothers tracing small crosses on the foreheads of children before bedtime, fathers hanging simple charms near doors and windows, dried herbs tied above the hearth to ward off illness and unwanted spirits. And though from a modern perspective these acts may seem superstitious, in the minds of medieval villagers they are threads in the fragile tapestry that keeps fear from overtaking the heart. Night itself becomes a world of symbols and warnings, for when darkness falls, the sounds outside shift and sharpen, and the peasants listen closely for the calls that drift across the frozen fields. The howl of wolves is the most familiar, rising and falling like a mournful song carried on the wind. But there are other creatures too, owls with their haunting cries, foxes digging through snow, the occasional distant cracking of ice that makes the world feel alive, restless, even watchful. These sounds, though natural, take on a deeper meaning during the long nights of winter, becoming part of the stories adults tell children as they fall asleep. Stories meant to explain the mysteries of the world in a way that both comforts and warns, tales of spirits wandering the fields, of guardian ancestors watching from the treetops, of animals that speak to those who listen, of star-filled skies that hold omens for the coming year. The stories are long, winding, filled with metaphor and imagination, and as the fire flickers gently across the children's faces, their eyes grow wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, because even though they know these tales are not entirely real, they also know that winter blurs the line between reality and dream, between the seen and the unseen, and so the stories settle into their minds like seeds ready to sprout into dreams. And dreams in winter are their own strange creatures, shaped by hunger, cold, soft light, and the endless sound of wind. People dream of warm fields of bread rising in ovens, of animals that speak in human voices, of lost relatives offering advice, of fires that burn bright without ever needing wood, and often these dreams are shared in the morning, told in quiet voices around the hearth, interpreted as signs or warnings or blessings, depending on the mood of the dreamer. Sometimes a dream will linger over an entire household, especially if it is vivid or unsettling, and the villagers will discuss it with the seriousness of people seeking meaning in a world without certainty. Because in winter even dreams feel important, as though the mind itself is trying to speak truths the waking world cannot yet reveal. Outside, the sky remains heavy with snow, the nights long, the winds sharp, but inside the cottage a delicate balance persists, faith pushing back against fear, stories softening the edges of reality, dreams offering escape, and the fire, always the fire, holding everything together like the heartbeat of the home. And though hunger still hovers, though illness lurks, Though wolves prowl the edges of the forest, the villagers endure by leaning into each other, into their rituals, their beliefs, their memories, and their quiet conviction that no winter, however brutal, lasts forever, that somewhere beneath the frozen earth seeds are sleeping, waiting for the first whisper of warmth to wake them. It is this belief, soft, fragile but persistent, that carries the villagers through the darkest part of the season, guiding them gently through the nights that feel endless and the days that feel short, reminding them that winter is both a test and a teacher, and that those who survive it emerge into spring, not simply alive but strengthened, wiser, more tightly bound to one another than before. And as you breathe slowly with the rhythm of this world, you can almost feel the shift inside the cottage, a tiny flickering ember of hope that will grow day by day until winter loosens its grip. As the winter slowly loosens its grip, not with a dramatic gesture but with 1,000 small, almost invisible changes, the villagers begin to sense the shift long before the snow truly melts, for the light lingers a little longer each afternoon, making the shadows stretch thinner across the fields, and the air, while still cold enough to sting the skin, carries a softness beneath it, like a whisper of warmth drifting from a distant season that has not yet arrived but is already on its way. The first sign is always sound, because winter is a season of muffled silence, and when the thaw begins, the world starts to make noise again. Droplets of water tapping rhythmically from the edges of roofs, the faint groan of ice loosening its grip on the riverbanks, the quiet snapping of branches that are no longer frozen rigid, and underneath it all, the soft, steady dripping that signals the return of movement in a landscape that had been held still for months. Inside the cottages, the villagers notice this shift with a mixture of relief and caution, because while spring promises salvation, the last weeks of winter are often the harshest in terms of hunger and fatigue. The cellars are nearly empty, the preserved vegetables shriveled and few, the grain stores reduced to a thin layer at the bottom of sacks, and even though the days are growing longer, the earth is still frozen solid, offering nothing yet in return for the months of waiting. Children begin to ask when the grass will turn green, when the animals can return to the fields, when the first wild herbs will appear, and parents answer with gentle patience, reminding them that spring arrives like a shy guest, slowly, modestly, never all at once, and that they must still be careful, still ration food, still tend the fire every night until the cold has truly faded. Outside, the paths that were once solid and crisp become soft underfoot, the snow turning grainy and heavy, and walking across the fields now requires a different kind of strength, each step sinking into a mixture of slush and mud, the ground giving way in unpredictable places. But even this difficult terrain carries the promise of life returning, because mud means warmth, and warmth means growth, and growth means the long-awaited end of scarcity. The animals sense the change before the humans fully accept it. The chickens linger near the doorway, tilting their heads at the fresh air. The goats tug restlessly at their tethers, eager to wander. Even the cows, usually so placid in winter, begin to stamp their hooves more eagerly, shaking their heads as though trying to wake the fields from their deep sleep. Inside the homes, clothing smells slightly different now, less of trapped smoke and more of air that has been allowed even briefly to circulate. Blankets are shaken out more often, windows cracked open for short moments to let out the accumulated heaviness of winter breath, and with each breath of fresh, cold but changing air, the villagers feel something shifting inside themselves, a slow reawakening of energy they had forgotten they possessed. But even as hope stirs, fear lingers quietly behind it, because the thaw also brings hidden dangers. Roofs weakened by months of snow begin to leak. Frozen ground turns to mudslides that can shift the foundations of homes. The river, once safely locked in ice, begins to crack open with unpredictable force, sending sheets of ice drifting downstream, and illness sometimes spreads more easily in the damp, fluctuating temperatures that accompany the changing season. The villagers, through centuries of inherited knowledge, know that spring is as treacherous as it is beautiful, and so they move with caution. inspecting walls for cracks, clearing gutters of ice, checking animals repeatedly, and watching the skies closely, because even a late winter storm, a wolf storm as it was sometimes called, could sweep in unexpectedly and steal back the progress of weeks. Still, there is an undeniable joy simmering beneath their caution, a joy that appears most clearly in the way they begin to speak. Conversations grow a little lighter. Laughter is heard again near the well. Children step outside without as many layers. Parents dare to plan the planting season. And even the priest's sermons take on a tone of renewal, of rebirth, of the earth awakening under God's gentle touch. In the evenings, the stories told around the hearth slowly shift. The frightening tales of winter spirits and wolf-haunted forests are replaced by gentler ones, stories of spring goddesses who coax flowers from the ground, of birds returning from distant lands, of rivers that open like blue ribbons across the land, of sunlight strong enough to warm stones and shoulders once more. And as another night falls over the village, though the air is still cold, the darkness feels different now, less like a weight and more like a curtain that will be lifted in the morning to reveal a world in transition, a world that is slowly exhaling after being held frozen for so long. The family settles again into their shared bed, blankets pulled close, but the cold that once seeped into their bones now feels a little weaker, a little less relentless, and sleep comes not as a desperate escape from the day's exhaustion, but as a gentle surrender to the rhythm of a season that is slowly, mercifully beginning to change. Outside, the snow continues to melt in tiny rivulets. The earth absorbs them like a thirsty creature finally given drink, and somewhere beneath the soil, still dark, still cold, but no longer lifeless, the first seeds tremble with the faint, ancient knowledge that soon, very soon, it will be time to return. And in that quiet, fragile interval between winter and spring, the villagers rest with a hope so small and yet so powerful that it feels almost sacred, the hope that they have endured the worst, and that the world will. Spring in a medieval village does not arrive like a celebration, but like a quiet revelation, a slow awakening that begins in the soil before it reaches the sky. And by the time the villagers fully recognize its presence, they have already felt it in 100 subtle ways, in the way the earth softens under their boots, in how the air smells faintly of thawed roots and wet bark, in how the mornings no longer bite quite as sharply at their skin, and most of all in the feeling, half instinct, half memory, that something beneath the surface of the world is stretching, opening, preparing to rise. The first truly warm day always catches them off guard, not because it is sudden, but because it is unmistakable. Instead of the pale, reluctant warmth of late winter, the sun finally steps forward with a bit more confidence, casting a mellow golden light across the fields, melting the last stubborn patches of snow, coaxing drops of water from the roofs like a steady rain, and warming stones and walls until touching them feels like touching a memory of summer. Children are the first to celebrate, running outside with their wool layers loosened, faces lifted toward the sky, marveling at the softness of the breeze that no longer feels hostile, and their laughter spreads like a ripple across the village, carrying with it a relief so contagious that even the adults pause in their work for a moment to breathe it in, to feel their hearts ease just a little after the long, heavy quiet of winter. But spring, beautiful as it is, brings with it a rush of labor that cannot be postponed, because now every hour of daylight carries urgent instructions. The fields must be cleared, the soil turned, the tools repaired or rebuilt, the animals released to graze, the fences mended, the roofs checked, the stored grain inspected for planting, and the seeds, tiny survivors of last year's harvest, must be coaxed into the earth with both precision and hope. Men walk out into the fields carrying wooden ploughs, their boots sinking into the softened ground, and as they press the ploughshare into the soil, they feel a deep sense of renewal, for the earth that was frozen and silent for months now offers itself willingly, breaking open in dark crumbles rich with promise, and the rhythmic groan of the plough dragging through the field becomes one of the first true songs of spring. Women emerge from the cottages with bundles of dried herbs, bits of last year's vegetables saved for seed, and clay pots filled with carefully stored kernels, and they move with a reverence that comes not from ceremony, but from lived knowledge, because planting is an act that holds the entire future in its palm. Every seed pressed into the earth is a wager against hunger, against chance, against weather, and against the delicate, unpredictable dance of nature that determines whether a family will feast or struggle in the months to come. Children help in small ways, gathering stones from the field, fetching water, running messages between adults, holding baskets of seeds with both hands as though carrying treasure, and though their tasks are simple, they matter, because spring is not survived by individuals but by an entire village moving together in one vast coordinated pulse. And in the midst of all this labour, there is a moment in every household when people pause, not to rest, but to acknowledge the miracle of surviving another winter, a miracle so ordinary to them, and yet so profound that they express it not through grand celebrations but through tiny gestures. A whispered prayer over the first seed sown, a candle lit in thanks at the small wooden altar beside the hearth, a handful of grain offered to the chickens with a murmured blessing, a mother tracing a protective sign over her children before they run outside again. The priest, too, plays his role, stepping out into the warming air with robes that sway gently in the spring breeze, offering blessings for the fields, for the flocks, for the families who stand before him with tired faces and hopeful eyes. And though his words are simple, they resonate deeply, because everyone understands that no amount of skill or effort can guarantee a good harvest. Spring is always a partnership between human hands and forces far greater than themselves. Nature, in its slow resurrection, becomes almost theatrical. Birds return in flocks that streak across the sky, like threads of music. The river, once locked in ice, begins to shimmer and flow again, carrying fragments of winter downstream. The first green shoots push through the damp earth, timid and pale but undeniably alive, and animals, once gaunt from their winter confinement, graze eagerly on the first hints of grass, their movements filled with a restless energy that mirrors the village's own. Even the cottages seem to transform, doors left open to let in the fresh air, blankets hung outside to shake away the last traces of smoke and winter breath, wooden bowls scrubbed in river water that is no longer painfully cold, and the floors swept clean of the straw and mud that built up over months of confinement. And as the rooms breathe again, the people breathe with them. At night, the air still carries a chill, but it is a different kind of cold now. No longer the deep, piercing cold of winter, but a fading one, a shadow retreating into memory, and families gather around the hearth, not in fear of freezing, but in warmth, sharing stories with a lighter tone, speaking of plans for summer, of harvests they hope to see, of animals they hope to breed, of festivals they hope to celebrate. And when they lie down to sleep, the blankets feel less like armor, and more like comfort. The darkness feels less threatening and more peaceful, and the silence of the night feels less like isolation and more like rest, because spring has begun its slow reclamation of the world, and in that reclamation the villagers find a renewed sense of belonging, not just to the land, but to the cycle of survival that defines their lives. The thawing earth outside the walls now holds the promise of life returning. The river murmurs like a soft lullaby of continuity, and somewhere beneath the soil, seeds begin their silent work, pushing upward with a force that feels almost divine. And the villagers, exhausted but grateful, drift into sleep, knowing that winter has finally loosened its grip, that they have reached the other side, and that the world, once harsh, frozen, and unyielding, is now slowly, gently opening again. Summer arrives in the medieval village, not with a single moment of triumph, but with a slow, luxurious unfolding, a gentle expansion of light and warmth that stretches across the land until everything, the fields, the river, the cottages, and even the weary bodies of the villagers, seems to breathe more deeply, more freely, as though the entire world has finally exhaled after months of holding its breath through winter, and now releases its tension into the soft golden air. The sun, once a distant and reluctant visitor during the winter months, now rises early and lingers late, painting the mornings with a delicate pale gold, and the evenings with a warm amber glow that settles softly over the fields, turning blades of grass into shimmering threads of light, and making the river gleam like polished glass as it winds lazily beyond the edge of the village. The fields, dark and barren not long ago, now transform into oceans of green, wheat rising in gentle waves, barley shimmering under the breeze, rows of vegetables pushing upward proudly from the soil, and in every direction you look, you can see the direct evidence of human labor, woven into the pattern of the land, each furrow a story, each plant a fragile victory against hunger, each patch of earth a testament to how deeply the villagers depend on the cooperation between their toil and the generosity of nature. From the first light of dawn, the villagers step into this world with tools over their shoulders, baskets at their hips, cloth wrapped around their heads to shield them from the sun, and a quiet sense of purpose guiding them, because summer may be beautiful, but it is also the busiest season of all, the season that demands constant attention, endless work, and tireless dedication, for every hour of daylight is precious and must be used wisely if the harvest is to be abundant. Men bend over the fields, their muscles straining as they scythe tall grass or pull stubborn weeds from the earth, sweat glistening on their skin and soaking into their shirts, the scent of soil rising warmly around them as the sun climbs higher and higher into the sky. Women move rhythmically through the gardens, their hands deft and gentle as they tend the vegetables, gather herbs, check the ripening fruit, shake out linen to dry in the wind, and collect clean water from the river before the heat of the day becomes too intense. Children roam between the adults, sometimes helping, sometimes playing, always learning, because summer is not only the season of work but also the season when the land becomes a vast classroom, where every plant and every animal offers a lesson in survival, in patience, in humility, before the rhythms of nature. They chase butterflies along the edges of the barley, dip their bare feet in the shallows of the river, and return home with hands stained green from grass and fingers sticky from wild berries found near the forest. Animals too seem to rejoice in summer's abundance. Cows graze lazily through thick grass that comes up nearly to their bellies. Goats scramble over rocky patches, nibbling at shrubs in the sunlight. Chickens scratch energetically in the dirt, searching for insects, and horses move with a renewed confidence across fields that were once frozen solid, their glossy coats shimmering in the warm light as they pull carts or ploughs alongside the villagers. Despite the peaceful appearance of the world under the summer sun, the work is unrelenting. Fields must be watered, pests must be chased away, tools repaired, hay cut and dried before sudden rainstorms, fences strengthened, livestock monitored for illness, bread baked daily in outdoor ovens heated by the sun itself, and all of these tasks weave together into a long, continuous tapestry of labor that stretches across every waking hour. Yet, there is a gentleness to summer's labor that winter never allowed. People work side by side, sharing stories, singing softly in the fields, to help pass the long hours, laughing together when the wind lifts their hats or when a curious goat wanders too close, and this shared effort creates a warmth of its own, a sense of unity that fills the space between them, like an invisible thread binding the entire village into one enormous family. When evening arrives and the sky fades from gold to purple, then to a deep velvety blue sprinkled with countless stars, the work finally slows, and for the first time all day the villagers lift their eyes fully to the horizon, watching the last hints of sunlight sink gently behind the hills, marking the end of another day in a summer that feels both infinite and fleeting, generous and demanding in equal measure. The cottages, now warm not from fire but from the sun that has heated their walls all day, glow softly in the dusk as families gather outside to eat simple meals, fresh bread still warm from the oven, bowls of peas or beans, wedges of cheese, cups of watered ale, and the air hums with the soothing sounds of summer. Insects buzzing in the grass, frogs calling from the riverbanks, birds singing their final notes of the day before settling into trees for the night. Sometimes musicians bring out simple instruments, flutes carved from elderwood, drums stretched with hide, small lyres or fiddles, and the sound floats through the village like a gentle lullaby, wrapping the evening in a calm that feels timeless, as though the world itself pauses to listen, to breathe, to enjoy the fleeting sweetness of summer while it lasts. As darkness deepens, families return inside, but the sleep that comes in summer is different from winter's heavy exhaustion. It is lighter, easier, as though the body finally trusts the world around it again, knowing that the air is warm, the earth is generous, and the food is plentiful for now. Blankets are thinner, windows remain slightly open to let in the soft night breeze, and the scent of flowers, fresh grass and river water drifts through the cottages, as people drift into dreams shaped not by fear or hunger, but by sunlight and abundance. And in those dreams you can sense gratitude, a deep, quiet gratitude for the season that renews everything it touches, that erases the harshness of winter's memory, that fills the world with sound and colour and promise. For summer is both a reward and a reminder, a fleeting season of grace between winters, a time when life feels fuller, sweeter, more expansive, and though the villagers know that hardship will return eventually, they allow themselves just for a little while to rest in the comfort of a world that is alive and overflowing. The fields breathe, the rivers sing, the forests whisper, and the villagers, wrapped in the warmth of the season, sleep peacefully beneath a sky so vast and gentle that it seems to hold the entire village in an embrace of starlight and silence. Autumn arrives in the medieval village like a soft sigh carried across the fields, a gentle turning of the world's great wheel, and although the warmth of summer still lingers faintly in the air, there is a new crispness to the wind, a subtle bite that brushes the skin and whispers ancient reminders that the season of plenty is finite, that the sun will soon retreat, and that the villagers must begin the long, careful ritual of gathering everything the land has offered before winter reclaims the earth. The fields, once green and vibrant under the summer sun, now stand tall and golden, the wheat swaying in slow waves as though bowing to the harvesters who step into the fields before dawn, with sickles glinting at their sides, their breaths rising in delicate clouds that fade quickly into the chill of early morning. And there is a solemnity to these first hours of the day, a sense that what they cut and gather now will determine the fate of their families in the months to come. Men and women work side by side, their rhythm almost musical, the soft whisper of blades slicing through stalks, the rustle of wheat falling into bundles, the low murmur of voices sharing stories or prayers, and the steady thump of grain being shaken free from its husk. And as the sun rises higher, casting warm golden light across the land, the villagers move with a quiet determination, fueled not by urgency alone, but by a deep understanding that this work is sacred, that harvest is both a reward and a responsibility. Children run between the adults carrying baskets, gathering fallen stalks, bundling sheaves, laughing as they race each other along the edges of the fields. But even in their light-hearted play they sense the importance of the season. They know that every grain counts and that their small hands are part of something much larger than themselves, a communal effort that binds the entire village into a single beating heart. When the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of warm oranges and soft purples, the villagers return home carrying full baskets and heavy bundles of wheat, while the scent of earth, grain and sweat lingers on their clothes, and though their muscles ache and their backs are sore, they feel a quiet satisfaction in the weight they carry, a reassurance that their hard work is slowly building the foundation for survival during the bitter months ahead. But autumn is not solely a season of labour. It is also a season of transformation, a time when nature reveals its beauty in ways both gentle and dramatic. Trees along the forest edge ignite in shades of scarlet, gold, and amber, their leaves falling like fragile sparks carried by the wind. The air becomes rich with the scent of ripe fruit, apples, pears, plums, waiting to be picked, dried, pressed into cider, or stored carefully in the cool shade of the cellars. The river reflects the changing colours of the world around it, rippling with copper and crimson hues as though carrying the season downstream. And in the midst of all this colour and activity, A quiet fear stirs in the hearts of the villagers, a fear that has been passed down through countless generations, the fear of miscalculation, of failing to gather enough grain or enough wood, of storing food improperly, of an early frost destroying the last of the crops, of illness spreading when the cold returns. This fear does not paralyze them. Instead, it sharpens their focus. They count every sack of grain, inspect every root vegetable, test the strength of every wooden beam that holds up the roof, check the walls for cracks that winter winds could exploit, reinforce fences, dry herbs for medicine, smoke meats to preserve them, and gather firewood in towering stacks that grow larger each day. Every act is deliberate. Every decision matters. Every hour of daylight is precious. And the villagers move with a confidence born not from ease, but from experience. Experience that has taught them that the line between abundance and scarcity is thin and must be guarded with vigilance. Yet, even with this undercurrent of caution, autumn carries a warmth of spirit unlike any other season. And this warmth culminates in the Harvest Festival, a celebration woven from gratitude, exhaustion, and hope. For one evening, the entire village gathers in the open space near the well, where tables are set with whatever fresh food remains: bread, cheese, fruits, roasted meats, and musicians play softly on flutes and fiddles, while children dance in circles beneath garlands of leaves and wildflowers. Lanterns carved from gourds and turnips glow with flickering candles inside, casting playful shadows on the ground as laughter floats into the cool night air. The priest offers a blessing for the harvest, his voice steady and calm as he speaks of the land's generosity, of the community's strength, of the divine grace believed to have guided their hands during the season of labor. And though the villagers know that winter still waits beyond the horizon, they allow themselves, just for this evening, to rest in the fullness of the moment. As the night deepens and stars scatter across the sky, families begin to return to their homes, pleasantly tired from the celebration, carrying with them the gentle warmth of shared food, shared stories, and shared hope. And when they lie down to sleep, listening to the soft rustle of autumn wind outside their walls, they do so with a deep sense of connection to each other, to the land, and to the eternal cycle of seasons that shapes their world. The fields outside whisper with the last movements of harvest. The trees glow softly under the moonlight, and the river flows steadily onward, carrying the reflections of autumn into the distance. And in that quiet, glowing world, the villagers drift into dreams not of fear or scarcity, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the season that has given so much, gratitude for the strength to prepare for what comes next, and gratitude for the fragile, beautiful truth that even as the world changes around them, the rhythm of life continues, steady and sure. As autumn fades into its final days, the golden fields now silent and bare, the last fruits gathered, the last logs split and stacked neatly beside the cottages, a subtle shift whispers through the village once more, a shift the peasants have learned to recognize, with a mixture of calm acceptance and instinctive caution. For the air sharpens again, the winds grow teeth, and the sky, once filled with warm sunsets and drifting leaves, begins to take on that familiar pale, washed-out hue that signals the return of winter. The first frost arrives quietly in the early morning, coating the ground with a delicate silver crust that sparkles under the fragile light of dawn. And when the villagers step outside to begin their chores, they pause for a moment, feeling the crispness beneath their boots, acknowledging silently that the wheel of the year has turned once more, bringing with it the ancient cyclical dance of survival and rest, of light and darkness, of warmth and cold. The animals sense it too. The cows shift uneasily in the barn, their breath rising in white plumes. The chickens remain huddled together longer than usual. Horses stamp their hooves, as though testing the air for answers. Even the river runs quieter, its surface stilling under the first thin sheets of ice that glide across the water like ghostly mirrors. Inside the cottages, final preparations take place with a calm precision born from generations of practice. Cracks in the walls are sealed one last time, the last vegetables are moved into the cellar, Herbs are hung above the hearth, blankets are washed and aired out in the weak autumn sun, and the windows are covered with cloth to keep out the drafts. Everything has been made ready, and yet there is always that quiet, lingering thought. Have we prepared enough? Will this winter be kind or merciless? Will the food last until the thaw? When the first snow finally begins to fall, drifting silently from a heavy grey sky, the villagers watch it not with fear but with a deep, steady knowing. Because winter is not a stranger. Winter is a stern but familiar companion, whose presence defines the rhythm of their lives, and though its touch is harsh, its arrival is inevitable, woven into the very fabric of existence. The fields that once overflowed with wheat now lie under a soft white blanket. The forests stand bare and skeletal. The river transforms into a narrow ribbon of frozen glass, and the world outside the cottage walls becomes muted, slow, dreamlike, as though the land itself has withdrawn inward to rest. Families retreat into their homes as the snow thickens, the doors close tightly against the wind, the fire rekindled with a reverence that borders on devotion, and in that warm, flickering glow the villagers settle into the long season ahead, not with dread, but with an understanding that winter is not merely something to survive, but something to inhabit, a time for stories, for quiet, for reflection, for drawing closer to those who share the small space of a single home. The fire becomes once again the heart of everything, its light dancing across walls of wood and clay, its heat a gentle embrace that reminds the villagers of how much they endured to reach this moment. Around it they gather with bowls of steaming broth, with mended wool clothing, with tools they will repair in the lull of shorter days, and with memories of the year that has passed, its hardships, its joys, its lessons. Children fall asleep to the sound of the wind brushing softly against the roof, their dreams shaped not by the fear of the unknown, but by the comfort of the stories whispered to them. Stories of spring's return, of seeds sleeping beneath the snow, of animals dreaming in their dens, of life simmering quietly in the earth. Even when the world seems frozen and still, the villagers know that the cycle will continue, that spring will eventually push its way through the frost, that summer will return with heat and labor and abundance, that autumn will offer its final feast before winter claims the land again. And in this knowledge there is a deep sense of peace, a trust in the eternal, unbroken rhythm of the natural world. And as the snow falls gently outside, settling in soft layers upon the roofs and the fields and the riverbanks, the village grows quiet, calm, warm, alive in its stillness. The fire crackles softly, casting shifting shadows across sleeping faces, and the wind hums a distant, ancient lullaby carried through the dark winter night. In this moment, nothing is rushed, nothing is feared, nothing is uncertain. There is only the slow, steady companionship of the season, the warmth of shared survival, and the deep, comforting truth that life, even in the harshest of worlds, moves in circles, endless, predictable, beautiful in their simplicity. The villagers close their eyes, wrapped in blankets, wrapped in memories, wrapped in the knowledge that they have endured, and as they drift into sleep, the winter settles around their homes like a vast, white cradle, holding them gently in its cold, quiet arms until the turning of the world brings the first light of spring once again.